Marty. Good day to all. I'm Bryan here from Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. So I'll be moderating this panel on Ostromian climate action. So climate policy is something that's been on the minds of many people, activists, policymakers in recent years. And even this year, in the next couple of months, we're going to have the UN Climate Conference in Scotland, where policymakers will gather to talk about the urgency of the climate crisis. And just last month, the IPCC latest report, was outlined and released, and the Secretary General of the United Nations announced the code red for humanity, stressing the urgency of action on various levels. So I think this is going to make for an interesting discussion. So for this panel, we have three speakers. Let me introduce them. First, we have Erik Nordman, Professor of Natural Resources Management at Grand Valley State University. Next, we have Nick Cowen, Senior Lecturer in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Lincoln. And also, we have Laura Albareda, Associate Professor from the School of Business Management at Lappeenranta University of Technology, Finland. So I'm just going to begin first by bringing Erik into the conversation. So Erik, you recently wrote a book, which I'm familiar with because we are going to do a podcast on that, The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, where you explore numerous examples that support Ostrom's claim that polycentric governance and self-governance on a community level can solve various problems, can solve many governance dilemmas. So can you introduce this idea to us and begin this panel discussion by sharing with us the relevance of Lynn's ideas, on environmentalism and contemporary climate action? Erik, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Bryan, and thank you to everyone for the past presenters and for the Institute Ostrom Catalunya for organizing this. So I'm a professor of natural resources. I study economics and policy, but my background is really in the natural resources side of this. So that's kind of the lens that I've come to know Ostrom's work, not from the democratic theory side. As many of you on the panel probably know, that Ostrom was studying initially groundwater management and collected all these case studies from around the world on natural resource commons. And the key question for the climate change is whether these lessons from local commons can scale up to global commons like the climate system. So I'd like to talk about two examples, one from Valencia, Spain, and then briefly introduce some of her work on municipal governance and public safety, because that really ties in with some of the ideas that she talks about later on. And then I'll pass the baton to the rest of the team to take that. So one example of one of these commons that she studied that's mentioned in Governing the Commons, but wasn't her original work. Other scholars had done a lot of work on this, was the Tribunal de las Aguas in Spain, Spain's famous water court in Valencia. And it's an example of one of these long enduring commons that, these cases that Ostrom collected. And the farmers around Valencia have managed their irrigation systems for more than 1,000 years. The water from the Rio Turia is a subtractable resource or depletable. It can get used up, but it's also difficult to exclude farmers from using the river water. So it sets up this commons dilemma. And the conventional wisdom was, well, that river water would quickly be depleted, in the tragedy of the commons situation. But the farmers devised ways to ensure that the water was shared. And it was a very adaptable approach. It's lasted through different political regimes, through droughts and floods. The farmers were able to establish and enforce rules about who gets the water, when they get the water, how much water they get, how much to contribute to the maintenance of the canal system. They created canal districts, and the farmers elected members of their own farming community to serve as district leaders and then represent them on this water court, which was a mechanism for resolving disputes. So this was just one example of how communities came together to manage these shared resources. And Ostrom collected case studies from around the world, irrigation communities in the Philippines and Nepal, forests and fisheries, fishing communities from around the world. And these inspired her 8 design principles. So we know from her work and the work of many of her collaborators, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, foresters, right? We know that under the right circumstances, local commons can be managed by the community. And famously, she said that the market and the state are not the only 2 options. In between lie a vast range of civil society institutions that can be, that through which we can come to organize and manage our shared resources. So that's just one example of her work on natural resources. But there's another strain or another body of work that Ostrom drew on when thinking about climate change. And that was her work in municipal governance. After her years as a graduate student studying groundwater management, she was really focused on those public entrepreneurs who were solving problems, and she looked to other areas of municipal governance. At that time in the 70s, there was a big push for consolidation in police, in schools, and other municipal services. The thinking was, why have a lot of many small districts or precincts when you could have one big one? And there was this big push for efficiency and consolidation. But there wasn't really any evidence to support that these would deliver better services at a lower cost. So she did the studies, and when it comes to policing, for example, she found that small and medium-sized police departments performed more effectively and often at a lower cost than large police departments. Some services, like labs, can be centralized, right? Labs can be expensive, but they can serve a lot of communities, like Bobby mentioned with the vaccines in the previous panel. But the bottom line is this polycentric approach seemed to work best, where you have many centers of power or action at multiple levels that can address local concerns. A one-size-fits-all consolidated approach didn't work in delivering municipal services. So when Ostrom turned her attention to global commons like climate change, she drew on these 2 areas of her own work: natural resource commons at the local level and this polycentricity approach. And her first attempt at looking at climate change was all the way back in 1992. So she had, this was 30 years ago. She gave a briefing at the Argonne National Laboratory with her colleague Michael McGuinness. This was just before the Rio Earth Summit and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. And Ostrom was very skeptical of this top-down approach to climate change. She wrote, the current emphasis on global solutions based on international conventions meant to establish global institutions to manage environmental change may be fundamentally misguided. So she was very skeptical of a one-size-fits-all, top-down approach to managing climate change. But she didn't really return to that issue of climate change until 2010, when she was invited to brief the World Bank. And the World Bank at the time recognized that climate change is a crisis of the commons, and drew on invited Ostrom herself to present some work, some ideas about that. She said that given the severity of the threat, simply waiting for the resolution of these issues at the global level without trying out policies at multiple scales, because they lack a global scale, is not a reasonable stance. The advantage of a polycentric approach is that it encourages experimentation by multiple actors, including the private sector and various states and subnational governments, and then developing methods to assess the benefits and costs of particular strategies adopted in one setting and comparing those results obtained in other settings. So Ostrom died in 2012, so she didn't live long enough to see the formation of the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement's pledge and review system aligns pretty well with Ostrom's polycentric approach. The non-binding voluntary aspect kind of avoids the problem of ratification in the US Senate. So one of Ostrom's colleagues said that, yeah, this was a global conspiracy to avoid the US Senate. So it doesn't have to be ratified because it's non-binding. But this approach does recognize that climate change requires a unified response. We need responses at all levels, but not necessarily, or not a uniform response. There's lots of opportunity for experimentation at different levels. And one thing I'd like to pitch to the audience is whether the drafters of the Paris Agreement intentionally used Ostrom's ideas, or was it a matter of convergence? I'm not sure about that, so I would welcome any comments that people have from the audience. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Erik, for your comments. It's interesting to me when we think of polycentric approaches to governance, it's not just a matter of private solutions and market solutions, you see. So it's interesting in conventional discussions, we think about centralization versus decentralization. There seems to be this dichotomy between state and markets, right? Mm-hmm. So at this point, I'd like to bring in Nick to the conversation. Do you think that, Elinor Ostrom's ideas are able to transcend this dichotomy, of state versus market, centralization versus decentralization? How are her ideas different in that sense?
Oh, thanks very much, Bryan, and thanks, Erik, for that initial kind of overview. I really enjoyed hearing about it and actually learning some new pointers that I wasn't aware of myself, and really learning a lot at this conference. So I guess I'm gonna address that question first by offering kind of an overview that looks a little bit like what Erik has been talking about, and then I'm going to zero in and explain how specifically these kind of alternative institutions, not quite markets, not quite states, can really help in particularly the local level at addressing some of the challenges of climate change. So what we are dealing with isn't a single solution to climate change. Rather, what we're looking at is multiple marginal solutions that together will help to keep the world livable for humanity. So even reducing net CO2 emissions, which is perhaps the most important challenge right now, isn't the only contributor to climate change, and global climate change isn't the only environmental challenge. Different parts of the solution are sometimes complements. In other words, they can reinforce one another, but they can also be in tension. For example, some aspects of recycling can be remarkably carbon intensive. So what does this mean in practice? So now I see that there is likely a role for states, kind of using the kind of consensual mechanisms that Erik was talking about. For CO2, I think that some sort of regional, maybe federal in the case of the US, or international tax on carbon emissions is likely to be important. That helps set the basic incentive for global society to economize on carbon emissions. But what do we need from more local levels of governance? We need innovations in how to reduce climate emissions in the kind of production processes that we're engaged in. We need innovation also in how to produce more effective offsets, such as carbon sequestration. And this is where I see market activity as we traditionally conceptualize it, that is entrepreneurs and firms competing to offer the best solutions. That's where I think they have the most to contribute. Now we need innovation also in the local enforcement and measurement of emissions, as well as these offsets. Now this problem is often neglected, but it's actually constitutive of the whole challenge. And that is something that central authorities really struggle to achieve. Anyone subject to bureaucratic targets and the games people play to meet them will know how difficult it is to develop effective measurement and enforcement mechanisms to actually get the outcome that you're hoping to see centrally. It's something that kind of we as people are often involved in higher education see all over the place, that even a relatively local institution can really struggle to incentivize actors to conform in the right way. And so we need to figure out ways of assessing and auditing efforts to contribute to this kind of solution to climate change. And these solutions, in my opinion, need normative buy-in from participants at both the individual and the community level. And this is where I see the role for commons institutions in particular. That's a key way to make enforcement effective rather than something that creates unwholesome, unintended consequences. And there I kind of draw on, kind of Ostram's or celebrated insights, about the way that commons institutions work, which is that they kind of involve a kind of deep and sort of durable norms that are kind of that have both kind of legal standing, but actually more importantly kind of moral standing. People think that it's important for them to participate, and people think it's important for them to participate when they can see others participating. So in other words, it's this ability to observe local actors where I think that these things are very important. So we've got business on the one hand delivering kind of practical, effective solutions that can be scaled through technological innovation. We've got governments setting the agenda, and then we've got kind of commons institutions playing a role, keeping everyone, everyone involved, measuring and assessing the outcomes in a kind of an appropriate way. Now, because anthropogenic climate change has already happened and continues to happen and is adding to existing natural sources of climate volatility, we also need innovations that will allow us to live better in its wake. And I think commons institutions have a role in combination with markets here. So markets are going to be what allow us to judge the effectiveness of commons institutions, and commons institutions are going to be what's going to kind of implement some of these solutions on the ground. And here I draw on a case study that I wrote up for a paper, Ostrom Floods and Mismatched Property Rights, published last year in the International Journal of the Commons. So the paper focuses on flood management in the United Kingdom. Floods have always been an issue in the UK, and they have become more dramatic due to climate change. And some of the harms associated with it are now inevitable, at least in the kind of medium term. And of course, as my background might indicate, I have a very personal interest in flood management, because this is the University of Lincoln campus where I am based. We are lakeside or poolside. It's a place called the Brayford Pool, very attractive, but it's right by the built up area, and it floods nearly every year. So we need to figure out how to manage that. So there are now quite a lot of inhabited and developed parts of the UK that are flood prone, and where central government and a few privatized corporations have had formal responsibility to protect. Yet other aspects of government policy has promoted a more laissez-faire approach to flooding, more recently because protective interventions are expensive and also, as it turns out, environmentally damaging. What we used to call marshes or swamps, we now call wetlands with complex habitats with plants and animals in which there is a public interest in protection. So the paper digs into the history and we found that at the beginning of the 20th century, flood management was mostly handled by local community-based institutions that were kind of dominated by large landowners. They didn't have quite the same claim to formal democracy that is some of the institutions that Erik was just talking about, but they did have some notion that there was feedback provided through kind of local interests being well represented. And this meant that land was drained only when it was judged to be economically viable to invest in flood protection by those with local knowledge of what was possible and what wasn't. And of course, that local knowledge may also have combined with an appreciation of local nature as well, although perhaps it was like not terribly emphasized in quite the same discursive way at the time. Now, when land was uneconomic to farm, as happened when farm labor costs rose in the 20th century in line with rising productivity more generally, a lot of it was abandoned to frequent floods. Now, this worried central government, who for various reasons wanted to ensure the UK had food independence, or at least the potential for food independence. So they subsidized drainage, aggressive land recovery, and permitted private development in those areas, with actors presuming the government would protect them indefinitely. Now, as climate change and other contributors to flooding have sort of grown, this has changed the calculation, and the government is really struggling to find the funds to keep its promises to protect these areas. So what we have is effectively a massive transitional gains trap embedded in the landscape, where many developments have happened following a government investment that looked viable at one time, but has become successfully more expensive economically and ecologically. So it's quite there's quite a pessimistic approach here, but more recent history, as the government has sort of withdrawn, there has been a recovery of kind of local interests and local interest in kind of managing floods more effectively. And the advantage of these community-based systems is that they know more about what the landscape can take and what can actually be done without having quite such a severe environmental footprint. So the use of sluices that can be installed on private land, and perhaps people can be compensated to receive, to kind of set aside their land, and also the use of kind of forestry and kind of rewilding, along riverbeds and along riverbanks, can allow for a kind of more natural means of kind of soaking up and absorbing floodwaters as they go. So there's no kind of one solution here. It's going to involve some kind of consolidation of wetlands. So in other words, people moving out of areas where it really is uneconomic to live and to work, but also in combination with with kind of local institutions that are able to kind of invest in their local area and actually realize, because they understand spatially what's actually possible, they're going to be able to produce some of the best forms of mitigation. I see that as kind of utilizing local knowledge. It's important that these local institutions have access to market pricing in order to understand how valuable the products and the kind of benefits of their particular activities are. So in the paper, I draw attention to the problem of farming subsidies, which happened before the EU, continued under the EU, and are likely to continue even now the UK has left the European Union. This is something that's seems to be a very hard political economy problem. And also the issue of land use planning, which has discouraged density in areas where it is economic to build, where there's a lack of where areas are not so flood prone. So I think reintroducing market pricing in those areas, basically in land use for housing and commercial development, and also to encourage greater densification, and also making sure that market pricing prevails in agricultural products, I think will help these institutions to work very well. Thanks very much. Looking forward to further comments.
Thank you very much, Nick. I would like to, at this point, bring in Laura into the conversation as well. Laura, I believe you have done extensive research on value creation and commons organizing in your university, with particular focus on environmental commons. In your opinion, how does this multi-stakeholder, multi-level approach look like? And also, I have been, coming across this term of the circular economy, this new concept. How do you think that fits into the conversation, particularly with Ostrom's work?
Yeah, hello. And I first want to thank Marty and Pau for inviting me to this session. And I am from Barcelona, so hello to everybody there. But I work in Finland now, and I want to explain my case because maybe there are other similar cases here, but I am not an economist. I am a scholar in business and management science. I work in corporate sustainability. So management science has been disconnected from the work of Ostrom for, not for many years, for always. There are not many research based on Ostrom work in my field. It's now increasing, but there are not many. In our field, business management science, we are facing many collective action problems that recently researchers in Academy of Management Review or our main journals have named grand challenges. So for example, how do business cooperate to manage climate change, clean water, plastic in the oceans? What makes these environmental issues different in management is that they involve common pool resources, and they are bounded by broad regional and planetary scale and used by thousands of organizations, sometimes distributed around the world. So these commons are degraded through business operational actions and global value chains. And the private sector does not have clear mechanisms or even regulations on how to cooperate with others to sustain the commons. Furthermore, self-interest and bounded rationality are key principles in our field. But these and this has been neglected by management scholars. In my specific line of research, corporate sustainability, we are facing also a main challenge. When we study corporate sustainability, we have been traditionally studying it as a simple issue. And so, for example, we have studied eco-efficiency or simple issues, but most of the challenges we are facing now connected to environmental, natural environment or commons, they are not any more operational measures. They are large system changes, and they are connected, as someone has said, that climate change is connected to water, clean water or ocean. So, and there has been a lack of integration of these topics. Research is still anchored in firm and industry level and firm behavior, and we are still studying single issues, toxic emissions, climate change, but there is a lack of integration of system thinking. There is a lack also of integration of data from environmental and natural sciences with business and environmental data and literature. And there is also need of empirical studies. You were also saying, I think it was Bobby saying that Elinor, I never met Elinor Ostrom, so I cannot call her Lynn, but that Elinor spent a lot of time in her career to gather data in order to frame the theory. And we don't have this empirical data in management. So, so based on that, for the last 5-6 years, I have tried to build research on business collective action. This is more or less the concept that we have created. Different scholars we are using to explore Ostrom contribution to business and management. And I managed to create a small research team, and we have been doing research, but there are also, as I was telling you before, there are also now other researchers that are working on that. And the main goal is to study and theorize how business address common pool resources. And we explore institutions for collective action on polycentric governance applied, for example, to local and global value chain. We explicitly conceptualize the role of firm in finding systemic solutions on global commons. We also talk about cross-sector interactions, cross-sector partnerships, sustainable entrepreneurship. I think it was now that the role of entrepreneurs are very important, and the role of societal stakeholders. We include analysis of large-scale global commons, social ecological systems, adaptive cycles, and cross-scale linkages. And it is also connected. It is also connected to the coupling of ecological sustainability and economic growth, or maybe using another concept, not growth, but also to the ethical foundation. And it also tackles stakeholder governance and joint value creation. So based on that, what I want to show now is some of our recent research on that. And I think I prefer to show you what we have done, because this is not only my main work I've done with the team, but this is a paper that has been just conditionally accepted. So I hope it will be published probably in the next 3 or 4 months in a very important management journal. And what we are studying, is circular economy. Circular economy in our field is now one of the main challenges that in corporate sustainability we are studying. And this is a big transformation of industry, because we are moving from industrial system that generates waste and has not taken into account waste as a resource till now, towards taking waste as a resource and bringing waste to the system again in different processes and business model that I'm not going to explain. But this research, I work with two colleagues from Aalto University, and we started to do this research 5 years ago. I was analyzing circular economy in Spain, and they were studying circular economy in Finland and in the States. So we had 3 cases with more than 60 interviews. And we originally, we didn't want to use Ostrom in this analysis, but we start to seeing that most of the challenges we were facing in circular economy were challenges that Elinor Ostrom was explaining in the commons governance. So in circular economy, one of the main barriers to have effective transformation is the mutual lack of resource information. So now waste is distributed across different industries and companies, but there is not a system of information. So when a company needs some secondary raw material from lithium, or they don't know where to look for, because there is not this system. There is also a lack of scale. When we use waste as secondary raw material, this waste could not be discontinuous for the industry. So it should be a continuous production of these residual material resources, and this is clear a main challenge. And there is also really disconnected governance of systems of residual resources. Some companies, they have one, other companies, some more urban residual systems. But all these 3 elements make us think that we could try to understand what were the barriers and the challenges of circular economy using Ostrom theory and polycentric governance. And this is what we have done. We, as I told you, we were studying 3 systems, one in the Basque Country in Spain with more than 40 interviews, then more or less 40 interviews in Finland, and around 20-25 interviews in Massachusetts. So what we found is that some of the elements of Ostrom's were clearly there. So there were emerging practices for collective agency. So the systems needed to, the actors in the system, and the actors are are private actors, but also in some cases local agencies that help to create this circular economy. So they together forming some protocols and shared strategies, and they are building some sharing systemic knowledge exchange in order to know where the waste is and where can it be located and distributed. And they also created some structures for sharing, some master plans for optimization of resources, and some sharing platform of these resources. And we also see these mutual adjustments that Ostrom and McGuinness are talking a lot about. There were some governance logics adjustments, so some of the roles of public actors or some companies adopted more a role of public administrations, and some public agencies were more adopting roles of the public actors. So there were also temporal frame adjustments. The time frame of the public industry is much shorter. The time frame of public one was longer, so they should adapt this. And also there were role adjustments. And what we also have seen is that there are interactions between, practices for collective action agencies are institutionalized into structures throughout the evolving over time. And these structures induce mutual adjustments, and the mutual adjustments facilitates practices, and also the way around. Structures facilitate practices, and practice lead to mutual adjustment. We didn't find any relationship here based on the data. So based on that, this was the first research, but we have been working in other type of research. I don't know if I have more time to explain, but I just want to explain what this is my current work, and it's about multi-level field dynamics. So when we talk about joint value creation, for sustainability, this is not new. Firms has been working with stakeholders, societal stakeholders, on value creation for sustainability for maybe now two decades, creating partnerships, cross-sector partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships. And what we are trying to study is the relationship between these three fields, that they are not connected. So firms create value with societal stakeholders related to local commons. And we see that at the same time, there are this growing area of polycentric governance. By the way, I didn't explain, we are studying this in the mining industry in Finland and Europe. So we are studying different forms, well, all the forms of joint value creation between firms and local and societal stakeholders for coping with biodiversity. In this case, it's not climate change, it's biodiversity in local operations or value chain strategies. And we are also studying the different units of policy making that has emerged in Finland since 2008, when it was created, the new mining, natural resources strategy emerged. And there are now different units of policy making. For example, I can mention all the circular economy. It's also connected to the mining industry and the recycling process. And we consider this as one of the units. And this is promoted by the Ministry of Economy. In the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, all the mining industry regulation is done, but also at the same time in the Ministry of Environment, there are this regulation on biodiversity. So we studied those two levels, and we want to see how these levels interconnect and what are the main elements that facilitate the firms to be part on the discussion on the policy making. And we have found that we call it deliberative forums. We take it from DRISEC, although DRISEC talk about citizens forum, but and we are studying some networks that has been created in Finland from the industry level, but also with societal stakeholder participation, mainly environmental NGOs. And these networks, like the Finnish network for mining sustainability, it's one. EIT raw material is another one. FIPS, it's the Finnish industry for corporate social responsibility. They have been deliberating and discussing and talking about this issue. So we try to understand what is this relationship, this feedback loop and recursive loop between one another. This is now, I don't have a more advanced approach on that, but this is really being important or interesting for us. I want to explain more, but I think we don't have more time, but these are two of the things that I think may be interesting. One of the things we see is that this could be translated to other commons. In this case is mining industry, which, by the way, it's very controversial. And before you talk about this contested and conflicting approach of Ostrom, this is also very important because there is a lot of conflict here. There is a lot of conflict. We talk about deliberative forums, but it's not only about easy deliberation. It's about conflicts and important conflicts. So this is the emergence of conflicts and contestation is very important also here, because there is a debate now in the mining industry and the policy making and government about which is the level, where should be the level, or where should we couple between economic growth and environmental sustainability. And it is not clear that the industry will accept this level, or it's not clear how the governments will force the industry to accept this level. But one of the solutions is circular economy. Instead of exploiting virgin raw materials, we have a lot of waste minerals and metal waste in Europe that could be reused. And the challenge is now the technologies and the mechanisms on separating these materials, mainly the technologies. And this is not easy because it requires a lot of investments. And one of the things, also in other research that I have done, it's that polycentric governance and this deliberation also need some investments towards, so the carbonizations, all the processes that require climate change and biodiversity governance. There should be systems to see who is going to invest and fund this. And in another model that it's not this one, we are saying that this should be public-private funding. So it's not only about governments, but it's also that the firms create systems for funding novel technologies and innovation solutions. But this is an ongoing process of research. I know, and I want to finish with that. When I was not trained as an economist, so I learned Ostrom mainly reading the books. I bought all the books and I tried to read mainly during the summer, the first 2 years. And I also look a lot of videos and try to understand. And also with my colleagues, we have worked quite hard to understand her work. But one of the main challenges when we went from the management science, we want to introduce this into political and maybe sociological science, is that for Ostrom's, at least from 1990 book, the Common Pool Resources, privatization and the role of private sector was really challenging. And it's true. I think the role of private, I am not trying to make here utopia. This is not about the good of the private sector. I have been doing research on private sector for a long time. I know that they will not do it voluntarily. So there should be some regulation, there should be some, but I think we cannot exclude private sector from the analysis of polycentric governance systems today, because they are key actors. And what we are seeing in another research is that some of these companies and some large companies are trying to understand that this is the only way possible if they want to sustain. And some of them, not many, some of them can play this role of convening firms for polycentric governance and collective action. The challenge is how to move the rest and how to bring the rest into this type of mindset of thinking, and of course, science plays a key role. And I think one of the things we see is that in these deliberative forums, scientists are needed. So scientists need to bring data and knowledge about what is happening and how this could, and connect this data, as I was saying, to business data and economic data. So more or less, this is what I wanted to explain. I thought it was interesting and useful to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your comments. We would now like to bring in some of the participants into the Q&A segment. So feel free to drop your questions down below the Q&A. We will be able to quiz the panelists on your questions. I think let me just begin with the question that Marty had asked, directed to any panelists who'd like to answer. How can polycentric systems help overcome the potential trade-off or conflict between environmental protection and distributive issues posed by policies like the carbon tax or agricultural transformation? How can it help mitigate some of this resistance? Any panelists, feel free to jump in at any point.
Sure, I can take the first crack at this one. I think when, in a polycentric system, you have solutions that are proposed, from the bottom up. So people understand, that they are they might bear some cost, but they're also going to get some benefit from this. And there may be spillover benefits too. But I think rather than having that, solution imposed on them from outside, having stakeholders, have that buy-in and trust in one another that there's going to be compliance is really essential. So I think that can start to overcome some of these trade-offs. I mean, it doesn't eliminate the trade-offs, but people understand and maybe more likely to be comfortable with those. I do have another example that I might talk about, and that's the 2030 district program. It's a chapter in my book, and I've got a paper coming out this month about it. Here in North America, the 2030 district program is a voluntary program in which building owners voluntarily pledge to reduce their building energy use, water use, and transportation related greenhouse gases, reduce it from a baseline by 2030. So that's the origin of this. And it's not just the building owners, the city actually is a participant as well. So the city draws this downtown district and invites building owners to join this voluntarily to reduce their energy use. And so that may take a cost, right? They're going to put in new insulation, they might put in a more efficient boiler or something like that. But in return, they get benefits. Some of those benefits might be access to clients or customers, preferred clients and customers. By doing this together, they get to share information, they get to experiment and, share their knowledge, what worked, what didn't work. So there's this sense of, yeah, we're doing this for the good of the community, but we're also doing this for our own benefit, and we're inviting others to do it together. So I think that, and it's polycentric because you've got the building owners, you've got the districts, and then you've got this network of cities all across North America. And there are 23 cities that have set up these 2030 districts now across North America, in the US and in Canada. So I don't know how well it's working. That's an open question that I'd like to get to, but they are proliferating, and it seems to be a possibility that this collaborative polycentric approach can go beyond regulations, what's required under building standards.
Thank you. I believe Nick has some thoughts and response as well.
Yeah, no, well, I agree with what Erik is saying. I just thought I would add to that I suppose, in theory at least, you can use a tax system to redistribute, say the price of carbon in a progressive direction. Although obviously some recipients of the benefits they're not going to be the same people as the people who are particularly hit by carbon in every case. So it's important that you still maintain like a kind of flat rate tax on that. And the other thing was, I know this is slightly avoiding the question in some way, but I think it's important to hammer home how often many solutions to climate change actually have progressive implications. And specifically, I'd think of land use planning reform. It's like land use planning has terrible implications for the way that low-income people live and work right now. They're often forced to live very, very far away from their workplace, much further away than they would choose to if we had a better system. Public infrastructure that encourages more use of public transport would have progressive benefits as well. And so I would say, while with this vexed issue of income and wealth inequality facing us, I'd say lean into that and focus on the areas that have immediate progressive benefits as well as environmental benefits. And I'd say that kind of urban, market urbanism is one area where that can happen.
Great, thank you. now I'd like to ask a question of my own, actually. So the climate agenda has been around for some time, and Eleanor Ostrom's work has been also around for some time, and making an impact in scholarly circles and policy discussion. So I'm just wondering, to all the panelists, what impact do you think that Ostrom has had on shaping the discourse over the years? Do you think that the discourse and rhetoric over climate policy has shifted in a significant way? And what more do you think can be done, by scholars and different organizations like these here represented today, to really, shift the discussion towards a more Ostromian perspective, in your opinion?
Erik, do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. What we see, what I see, for example, now we are doing a research about this mobility transition. In Finland, it is very, very important now. We are going through a clean mobility transition, and in order to reduce CO2 emissions. And what I see is that all the pieces of Ostroms are there. There are in Helsinki, some neighborhoods have created some labs. There are citizens labs to reduce CO2 emissions as building owners, as Erik was saying. But also there are new entrepreneurs now that are creating new platforms, digital platforms to integrate public transport. The government is also we have new regulations for that. Researchers are there. Also, there are a lot of research projects to support this transformation. But I don't know if all we know about Ostrom. I think that there is this, the pieces are there. I see, at least in Finland, in mobility now. Also large corporations I think they are taking an eye at least of this transformation, but I don't think that they have Ostrom in mind. It's more other type of concepts that maybe in Europe has been more disseminated by the European Union, like cross-sector partnership, public-private partnerships, innovation, or citizens lab, all of these concepts that here. But if you look at it from the lens of Ostrom theory, you can see the pieces. You can see they are not connected yet. That's also important to say. But I don't think Ostrom is known by companies. The private sector doesn't know it. So when we have to explain it, it's difficult to explain it. And I think there's a lot of work to do if we want to. At least for the private sector, there is a lot of work to do to disseminate Ostrom ideas. Companies don't know it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you definitely get a sense that there's an Ostromian approach with the Paris Agreement in its structure, whether it's intentional or just convergence, I'm not sure, but it definitely, the Paris Agreement structure does tend to embody most of those design principles that Ostrom identified for local commons. The challenge will be in, so there's that polycentric element, but the challenge will be in the enforcement, I think, and avoiding free riders. So, and that's kind of the phase that we're entering now. The pledges are coming in, the COP26 is coming up soon. There's going to be, this push for ambition going into that. But now the rubber hits the road. Are countries actually following through? And the United States, we withdrew from the Paris Agreement several years ago. Now we're back in. It's unclear whether, our government, our Congress will actually come forward with a pledge, but, with legislation that will, push the pledge into enforce. But we have action at the city level, the state level. So there is that opportunity. So whether enforcement will happen through trade sanctions or something else, I don't know. I think that's going to be the big challenge now. We have these voluntary rules in place. How do you enforce it?
Thank you. I would like to give Nick, I guess, the last word here. How do you think we can increase awareness on Ostromian climate action?
Well, I thought, I suppose I'm tempted to end on a slightly personal note, which is actually, I think, the ideological innovation that Ostrom has engaged in. And I think that if I think back to the way that many of us, like classical liberals, and well, at least me in particular, thinking 10 years ago about climate change, there was a certain kind of fatalistic element to it, that it was kind of like, well, either we're going to end up with a much, much poorer world, or we're going to end up with a much, much hotter world, which led many to kind of like try and pick between, or potentially just to try and argue there wasn't that much of a trade-off. Whereas Ostrom, as a founder of public choice as a research program and new institutional economics, which of course is kind of very, it has an association with the classical liberal tradition. She's sort of made a space where it goes like, well, you don't have to be, entirely market skeptic. You don't have to be kind of all in with kind of state authoritarianism and still in order to care about the environment. She offers a discourse and a set of solutions which suddenly, we kind of realize, well, where there's a space for community and individual action. So it's methodological individualism, it's the knowledge problem, it's got all these things that we care about very, very deeply. And it's saying, well, actually, we can get this together and we can use that to take it to a level where we can solve this, perhaps the biggest problem that humanity has ever faced. And so I think that's a message that we can like take out there and kind of use to say, you can be an environmentalist and come from all kinds of ideological perspectives, including what might have been assumed to be more conservative or classical liberal, libertarian, or anarchist in the past. And these are our solutions to it, and they actually work. Just as markets can deliver growth in the right environment, they can also help us live well together in a slightly lower growth environment.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great place to end this panel. Thank you, Erik, Nick, and Laura, for your great comments. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Marty, I'll hand the time over back to you.